Prince George, British Columbia, a city surrounded by dense forests where the hum of logging trucks and the scent of fresh cut timber filled the air. It was a place where hard work was the backbone of survival, and for indigenous families like the Jacks, life was often an uphill battle. Ronnie and Doreen Jack were no strangers to struggle. They lived in a modest home, doing their best to provide for their two young sons, Ryan, who was 9, and Russell, just 4 years old. Ronnie, a quiet but hardworking man, had spent years taking on tough labor jobs, while Doreen balanced caring for their children and picking up work wherever she could. Money was always tight. Some weeks, the fridge was nearly empty, and the bills piled up faster than they could pay them. But despite the hardships, their home was filled with love. Ronnie and Doreen were devoted parents, always putting their boys first. Ryan and Russell were inseparable, two playful spirits who spent their days running around the backyard, dreaming of adventures far beyond their small home in Prince George. Still, there was a lingering worry. Work had been scarce for Ronnie lately, and every day without income was a step closer to losing everything. He had been searching for something steady, something that would finally give his family security. That's what made what happened next so unsettling. Because when an opportunity finally came knocking, it wasn't through a job listing. It wasn't from a friend or a trusted employer. It came from a stranger. A man whose name no one would ever remember. August 1st, 1989. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. Ronnie had gone to the First Leader pub, a familiar place where men gathered after long days of hard labor. It wasn't unusual for workers to find job leads. Their many deals were struck over cheap beer and quiet conversations. But this wasn't just another job lead. Sitting at the bar, Ronnie found himself talking to a man he had never met before. No one knows exactly how the conversation started, but what we do know is this: the man had an offer, one that sounded almost too good to be true. He told Ronnie about a high-paying logging job at a remote camp. It wasn't just work for Ronnie. Doreen could come too. She could cook in the camp's kitchen, and the best part, the camp even had a daycare for their kids. Ryan and Russell wouldn't be left behind. This was a rare opportunity. Ronnie had worked in logging before, but steady jobs like this didn't come around often, especially ones that could support the whole family. The pay was supposedly good, the conditions promising. But here's where things get strange. No one else at the pub remembered the man. He wasn't a regular. No one could even recall his name or where he had come from. He had appeared out of nowhere, and before the night was over, he had convinced the Jack family to pack up their lives and leave with him. Not tomorrow, not next week. That very night. And that decision would be the last one they ever made. It almost seemed too good to be true. A well-paying job at a logging camp, steady work for both Ronnie and Doreen, and even childcare for Ryan and Russell, everything they needed, handed to them in a single conversation. But desperation has a way of making people ignore warning signs. Ronnie and Doreen had been struggling for months, maybe even years. Work had been unstable, and with 2 children to feed, turning down an opportunity like this wasn't an option. That night, after returning home from the pub, Ronnie picked up the phone and dialed his mother. His voice was calm, but something about it felt off. "We got a job," he told her. "We'll be gone for 10 days. He didn't say where exactly. He didn't mention who had hired them. His mother asked for more details, but the answers were vague. Then, as quickly as the call began, it ended. That would be the last time anyone would ever hear from Ronnie Jack. By the next day, the decision had been made. The Jack family was leaving. Neighbors later recalled seeing them packing up their modest belongings. They didn't take much, just enough for a short trip. It seemed rushed, but no one thought much of it at the time. After all, they had been offered work. This was supposed to be a fresh start. And then there was the truck. A dark colored pickup pulled up outside their home. The same truck that had been mentioned in Ronnie's phone call. The man behind the wheel. The same stranger from the pub. Doreen and Ronnie helped their children climb into the back seat. Then they got in themselves. And just like that, the truck pulled away from the house, rolling down the quiet street and out of sight. It was the last confirmed sighting of the Jack family. They had vanished. At first, no one panicked. The Jack family had said they'd be gone for 10 days. Maybe they were in a remote location, out of reach. Maybe they were just too busy settling in. But as the days stretched into weeks, something felt wrong. There were no phone calls, no letters, no signs of life. Ronnie's mother tried calling around, reaching out to people who might have heard from them. Nothing. No one knew where they had gone. No one had spoken to them since that night. Friends started asking questions. Was this job offer real? Who exactly had hired them? Why hadn't anyone seen them come back into town for supplies? A quiet, gnawing fear began to creep in. The Jack family hadn't just left for a job. They had disappeared. It took time for the alarm bells to truly ring, but when they did, the concern turned into full-blown panic. The Jack family was officially reported missing. Police began looking into their whereabouts, but almost immediately they hit a wall. There was no trace of them. No one at any logging camp had heard of them. No employer had hired them. No one had even seen them arrive at a worksite. It was as if they had never existed. Investigators checked local roads, hoping to find any sign of their journey. There were no abandoned vehicles, no tire tracks leading to a hidden location, no discarded belongings. And then there was the biggest mystery of all: who was the man that had offered them this job? No one could identify him. No witnesses at the pub knew his name. No records of employment linked him to any company. It was as if the man himself had vanished along with them. This was the question that haunted everyone: the police, the Jack family's relatives, and the entire community. Who was the man at the pub? He had offered the Jacks an opportunity that seemed perfectly suited to their needs. A well-paying job, a place for Doreen to work, and even daycare for their children. It was everything they had been looking for. But when investigators asked around, no one seemed to know him. Bartenders at the First Liter pub had no record of the man. Regulars didn't recognize him. No one knew his name. No one could even recall what he looked like, other than vague descriptions of a middle-aged man driving a dark-colored pickup truck. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere, just long enough to convince the Jack family to follow him, and then vanished without a trace. Had he been watching them? Had he specifically targeted them, knowing their struggles and desperation? Or was this an unfortunate coincidence, an encounter with the wrong person at the worst possible time? Either way, one thing was clear. Whoever this man was, he had taken the Jack family somewhere, and they had never come back. In the early stages of the investigation, police had to consider every possibility. What if the Jack family had simply left on their own? Maybe they had started a new life somewhere else. Maybe they had cut ties with their past and didn't want to be found. It had happened before. People sometimes disappeared voluntarily, slipping into the shadows of a different city, a different life. But there was just one problem. There was no sign of them anywhere. Their bank accounts remained untouched. No new financial transactions, no attempts to withdraw money. Their government-issued health cards were never used again. There were no reports of the family turning up at any social services office, no hospital visits, no paperwork filed under their names. And then there was the fact that no one had seen them after they left their home. Not a single confirmed sighting. No witnesses recalled them stopping for gas or food on their way to the supposed logging camp. No motel stays, no road trip detours. It didn't make sense. If they had willingly left for a better life, they would have needed money. They would have had to buy food, supplies, clothing, something. But there was nothing. It was as if they had been swallowed by the earth itself. It was a short conversation. Too short. The last time anyone heard from Ronnie Jack was the night of August 1st, 1989. He had just accepted the job offer, and before leaving, he called his mother to tell her the news. He kept it simple. They had found work at a logging camp. They'd be gone for 10 days. Everything was fine. But something about the call didn't sit right. He didn't say where the camp was. He didn't mention who had hired them. He didn't even sound like himself. His mother later recalled that his voice was off, not panicked, not rushed, but strange, almost like he was being careful about what he said. And then, just like that, the call ended. Ronnie never called back. At the time, his mother didn't know she had just spoken to her son for the last time. Now, looking back, one chilling question remains. Was he vague because he didn't know the details? Or was he vague because he wasn't alone? With no crime scene, no bodies, and no known suspect, speculation ran wild. Investigators struggled to piece together what had happened. The Jack family had vanished without a trace, but why? And more importantly, how? Some believed the job offer was real, but far more sinister than it seemed. What if they had been taken to an illegal work site, forced into labor under dangerous conditions? What if they had died there, their deaths covered up by those running the operation? It had happened before. Unregulated logging camps, remote work sites, places where people could disappear and no one would ask questions. But then there was another, even darker theory. What if there had never been a logging job at all? What if the stranger at the pub had lured them away for an entirely different reason? If that was the case, then the Jack family hadn't just vanished. They had been taken. As the investigation dragged on with no answers, one unsettling truth became impossible to ignore. The Jack family's case was not unique. Across Canada, hundreds of Indigenous families had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Many of their cases had been dismissed, overlooked, or buried under bureaucratic indifference. The pattern was undeniable. For decades, Indigenous men, women, and children had been disappearing along British Columbia's Highway 16, a stretch of road now infamously known as the Highway of Tears. The Jack family was just one of many, and the similarities were chilling. A family struggling to make ends meet, a too good to be true offer, a mysterious figure no one could identify, a disappearance that left nothing behind. These cases shared another grim connection, a lack of urgency from authorities. Had the Jack family been white, would the search have been more aggressive? Would resources have been mobilized faster? Would their faces have been plastered across national headlines? For many in the Indigenous community, the answer was clear. The system had failed them, just as it had failed so many others before. And as the years passed, it became painfully clear that if justice was ever going to come for the Jack family, it wouldn't come from law enforcement. It would have to come from the people who refused to forget them. Time didn't erase the Jack family, it only made their absence more unbearable. Prince George was a town where people knew each other. When someone went missing, people talked. But when an entire family vanished, it sent shockwaves through the community. At first, there had been hope. Maybe they would return. Maybe they were just out of reach, working somewhere deep in the woods, waiting for the right moment to come home. But the weeks turned into months, the months into years, and there was still nothing. No bodies, No new leads, just a painful silence that stretched on and on. For some, the Jack family became another tragic mystery, a story whispered about in bars and late night conversations, but one that eventually faded into the background. But for Doreen's sister, Marlene Jack, the fight never stopped. She refused to let them be forgotten. She pushed authorities to investigate. She contacted reporters. She spoke at rallies, demanding answers not just for her family, but for every indigenous person who had disappeared without justice. And yet, the years rolled by with no resolution. For the Jack family, there were no candlelight vigils led by politicians, no viral media campaigns bringing attention back to their case, just an unshakable, unbearable truth. A family of 4 had vanished, and no one could tell Marlene why. 7 years had passed, 7 years of silence. By 1996, the case had long gone cold. There were no new witnesses, no new evidence, and no leads. But then, out of nowhere, something happened. A call came in anonymous, cryptic, and deeply disturbing. The voice on the other end told police that the Jack family had been murdered and buried on a remote ranch outside of Prince George. For the first time in years, there was a sliver of hope that, at the very least, the truth could finally be uncovered. The location was specific enough to warrant a full-scale search. Investigators mobilized immediately. They had no idea what they were about to find, or if they would find anything at all. If this tip was real, it could finally explain why no one had ever seen the Jack family again. If it was false, it meant someone was deliberately toying with an already grieving community. But when investigators arrived, what they found was worse than they could have imagined. The police spent days scouring the property, searching for any trace of the Jack family. They dug up soil. They brought in forensic teams. They looked for bones, clothing, disturbed earth, anything that could prove the family had been there. But there was nothing. No human remains. No signs of a burial site. Not a single piece of evidence linked the Jacks to this location. Just empty land and unanswered questions. The anonymous tip had led them nowhere. So who made the call? Had it been a cruel prank meant to reignite false hope in the hearts of those still searching? Or was it something more sinister? Had someone wanted police to focus on the wrong place to steer them away from the real location of the Jack family's remains? Because if that was the case, it meant that someone out there knew exactly what had happened. And they wanted to make sure no one else ever found out. If the Jack family was taken, one question remained: why? They weren't wealthy. They had no known enemies. There was no reason for a random abduction unless there was something much darker at play. Some investigators considered the possibility of human trafficking, the offer of a job, the promise of a better life. It was a classic tactic used by traffickers to lure vulnerable families away from safety. But if that was the case, why had no one ever come forward with information? Trafficking victims sometimes escaped, sometimes resurfaced years later. But in this case, it was as if the Jack family had been erased. Then there was another theory. What if the Jacks had been taken for forced labor? Illegal logging operations, hidden work camps, places where people could be used, worked to exhaustion, and discarded without anyone ever asking questions. But there was no evidence that they had ever arrived at a work site, which led to the most chilling possibility of all. What if the man at the pub wasn't looking for workers? What if he was looking for victims? A predator hunting for a family that wouldn't be missed right away. A man who knew exactly what to say, exactly what to offer, to lure them away forever. And if that was the truth, then this wasn't just a disappearance. It was a perfect crime. The only real clue in the case was the truck, a dark-colored pickup, A vehicle seen by multiple witnesses on the night of August 1st, 1989. And yet, despite all those eyes on it, it was never identified. No one could remember the exact make, model, or even the license plate. It was a ghost, existing only in the memories of the few people who saw it before it disappeared into the night. Police combed through records of similar vehicles in the area. They checked registrations, stopped trucks matching the description, interviewed people who might have seen something. But every lead collapsed into nothing. It was almost as if the truck had never existed. Or worse, whoever had taken the Jack family had planned it that way. What if the vehicle was stolen, used only for this crime, then discarded or destroyed? Or what if the man driving it wasn't a stranger at all? What if someone in the community, someone the Jack family trusted, had been the one behind the wheel that night? Because if that was true, then they had never stood a chance. For over 3 decades, investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives have pored over the case of the Jack family, trying to piece together what happened that night. Some believe that the job offer was real, that the Jack family actually made it to a logging camp, but something went horribly wrong. An accident, maybe, a workplace death that needed to be covered up. If that were the case, there would have been every reason to make sure no one ever found them. No bodies, no reports, no evidence linking them to the site. But that theory had a fatal flaw. If they had arrived at a logging camp, wouldn't at least one person have seen them, heard about them? Even anonymously, someone could have come forward. Yet in over 35 years, no one ever has. That led to another, more chilling theory. What if the Jack family was taken somewhere far from Prince George, somewhere so remote, so isolated that no one would ever find them? If the man at the pub had been a predator, someone looking for an easy target, then maybe there had never been a logging job at all. Maybe the job offer was just a trap. And if that was true, then the Jack family never had a chance. Over 3 decades later, the disappearance of the Jack family remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Canadian history. No bodies, no evidence, no confirmed suspects. Just a phone call, a truck, and a family that was never seen again. For their relatives, especially Doreen's sister, Marlene Jack, the pain never faded. She fought tirelessly, pushing authorities to keep the case alive, refusing to let her family be forgotten. She wrote letters, contacted law enforcement, and begged for answers. But none ever came. The Jack family's case is now part of a much larger crisis, the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous families across Canada. A crisis that has left countless families like Marlene's still searching for justice, still waiting for the truth, still wondering how someone could erase an entire family and get away with it. No matter how much time passes, the questions surrounding the disappearance of the Jack family remain as disturbing as ever. Who was the man at the pub, and why did he choose the Jacks? Was it random, a crime of opportunity against a family in need? Or had he been watching them, knowing exactly how to lure them in? And if the Jack family really made it to a logging camp, why was there no record of them anywhere? Not a single paycheck, no paperwork, no coworkers who ever remembered meeting them. Had they even made it that far? And then there's the hardest question of all, one that has been asked in far too many cases like this one. Why did this case, like so many other missing Indigenous families, receive so little attention? Would things have been different if the Jack family had been wealthy or lived in a different neighborhood? Would investigators have pushed harder? Would the media have stayed on the case? Or was this just another tragedy that people in power were all too willing to forget? The Jack family didn't just disappear. Someone knows what happened. Maybe the truth is buried somewhere deep in the forests of British Columbia where no one will ever find it. Or maybe it's buried in the memories of someone who refuses to speak. Someone who was there, someone who saw something. A single phone call, a truck, and an entire family that was never seen again. Was this a perfect crime? Or is the truth still waiting to be uncovered?